Pacific American Heritage Month. During this challenging time, we can be more grateful than ever for the contributions that Asian Pacific Americans are making to our country. Asian Pacific Americans are nearly 7% of our national population now, and we are represented in every sector of the economy. Asian Pacific Americans have won Nobel Prizes in the sciences and the arts, flown into outer space, and designed some of our country's most acclaimed public buildings. Asian Pacific Americans have formed cutting-edge technology companies, and Asian Pacific Americans work in every mode of transportation here at the department and throughout the federal government. I come from this community and remember the challenges that my family and I faced while growing up. To help ensure that the doors of opportunity remain wide open, I have launched and supported initiatives to help Asian Pacific Americans advance within the federal workforce and access opportunities in federal contracting. This year, it's hard to get together in person for the annual celebrations. So I am just delighted that we're having this virtual celebration and recognition of the contributions and achievements of Asian Pacific Americans in an increasingly diverse America. Asian Pacific Americans are contributing to making America the exceptional nation that it is. Thank you so much for what you do to serve our country. All the best to you and your families. Thank you.
We'll start our program with our guest speakers. First up is 1882 Foundation Director Ted Gong. Summit Tunnel is an icon of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Chinese contribution to the construction of key infrastructure linking east to west. Over to you, Ted.
So I first want to thank APA, the Asian Pacific American Employees Association, for providing me this opportunity to be part of DOT's celebration of APA Heritage Month. If we could show the first slide, I'm especially honored. I'm especially honored to follow Secretary Chow in her comments, and I want to build off an inspiring speech the Secretary made last year, also in May at Promontory, Utah, during the celebrations of the 150th anniversary of the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, and in a later letter she wrote to the Washington Times. The Secretary's speech is captured in its entirety in a newly released short film documentary called Legacy by Joseph Flannery from the U.S. Forest Service. I recommend you see this film. It was officially released this month, and it's available on YouTube. The film covers the construction and the significance of the Summit Tunnel. So in the time that I have here, I'm not going to repeat what you can see on the film. For the time that I have here, I want to build on a question that Secretary Chow suggested in her letter published after her return to DC from Utah. Why is it that Chinese American contributions in such a critically important national project is not well known? Why are there no Chinese American heroes in our popular folklore that relate to the heroic contributions? Why are there no Chinese American larger than life characters in the vein of Paul Bunyan or John Henry? Take a look at the next slide. The Secretary mentioned Promontory was a singular opportunity for her to learn about the Transcontinental Railroad and the Chinese contribution to it. People should go there to learn about the history, but a better educational space, and I invited the Secretary to come to the summit, is the Summit Tunnel. It's much more dramatic, it's more accessible for promoting public education about the railroad and the Chinese construction. It's near Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada mountains off Highway 80 between Sacramento and Reno. This is a picture of our team inspecting a campsite that supported the railroad construction. By the way, at the bottom, you can see the YouTube link to see our film. Next slide. To cross the mountains, and if you could show the next slide, to cross the mountain, this is a historical photo of that same site. To cross the mountains in what was then railroad construction done at the highest elevation anywhere in the world. The Central Pacific Railroad had to dig and chisel out 15 tunnels. At this site, this was a camp that housed up to 3,000 workers to build trestles, lay track, and dig these tunnels. And this is tunnel number 6, and we refer to this as the Summit Tunnel. When we usually talk about the Summit Tunnel, this is what we're doing. What you can see that there are no braces supporting it. It doesn't need any. It was literally chiseled through sheer granite, 1,570 feet of it, inch by inch over 2 years, that included 2 of the worst snowstorms in history. And in the 1860s, this was done with picks and hammers with explosives. There wasn't even dynamite at that time. Toward the end of the construction, they began experimenting with a chemical which was called nitroglycerin. And that had a lot of explosive problems, but it helped the construction quite a bit. Now, to build these tunnels, the workers and engineers dug inward from the east and west sides, but they also dug a shaft from the very top. 70 feet drop to the center of what the engineers calculated to be the level of the tracks. They then opened up the faces to build outwards to meet the incoming construction. And when they were finished, they were only off by about a few inches. The next slide, you can show the next slide. But even after the constructions, the trains could not easily cross the summit during the winter because of the snow. So the railroad tried to use huge snow plows mounted on the front of the locomotives, but they had to resort to building snow sheds to cover the tracks so the trains could move. Chinese built miles and miles of these sheds, and over the decades, the wooden sheds were replaced by concrete ones like this. Here's another view in the next slide. Let's take a look also at the next slide. Next slide. And the next slide. And the next slide. And the next slide. What you saw in the previous slides was a sampling of the rampant and growing graffiti within the tunnels. There's a body of wall artists like this person here pictured here who see it as their right to use the walls for their purposes. Next slide. They are supported by a media presence that espouses a sort of pseudo ideology represented in the next slide. So take a look at the next slide. They have this ideology, but I sort of think it's like free vomit, right? Next slide. Now, amazingly, the Summit Tunnel and the area around it is not protected in any way. The U.S. Forest Service manages the surface areas around the site and maintains some trails. But at the summit, most of the land, including the tunnels, are private property, mostly owned by Union Pacific Railroad and business interests, a ski resort, restaurants, and so forth. There are no trespassing signs at places, but day visitors, hikers, and rock climbers go throughout the area pretty freely. The numbers are growing. Take a look at the next slide. There is not even a historical designation at the site. There is a metal plaque that was hammered into a rock in front of the Chinese wall, put up by local historical society, but nothing from the federal government, nothing from the state, nothing from even the county government. Next slide. So if we can show the next slide, you can see that this situation leaves visitors to ignore the historical and engineering significance of the tunnels and the area around it. They look over the area, they take pictures of themselves against things they find most impressive. Next slide. So let's return to Secretary Chow's question of why do we not know about the Chinese American contributions to this incredible historical engineering and labor achievement represented at the site, and its critical significance to the uniting of the American nation. Next slide. Why does our American folklore not have Chinese American figures who have been modeled after these 3 men? These 3 people were honored at the 50th anniversary of Transcontinental Railroad. They are three of the 8 original Chinese crew who laid the final connecting rail at Promontory in May 1869. And take a look at these guys. They're tough, they're regular, rugged people. Instead, what kind of images do we have? We have Hop Sing from Bonanza, right? So next slide. Between 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad workforce was Chinese. It is estimated that 10% died in its construction through snowstorms, explosives, equipment accidents, the crossing into the deserts, and the race to Promontory. This was about 2,000 workers that died. And we can guess this because the railroad company kept records, not of the individuals that were shipped back or killed, but the cost of shipping 20,000 pounds of bones back to relatives to China as part of the worker compensation provisions in their contracts with the railroad workers. So how do we want to remember these people in the tunnels? As the Department of Labor slide of the Wall of Honor states, they are ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And on the wall, there's the additional adage representing America at its best. Take a look at this next slide, the final slide. The issue for us is not just about uncovering and remembering our Chinese and our Asian American forebears. It is also about what we do as an American nation. How do we teach our youth about American values that can be illustrated in our historic places? 2,000 workers died building these tunnels and other parts of the railroad. They were part of a workforce that included Irish and Mormons and many nationalities who contributed to a nationally unifying project that was endorsed by President Abraham Lincoln. Their legacy, I hope, is not to be as this young girl is going to remember from her visit to the Summit Tunnel graffiti. It's in closing, there are 128 national monuments in the United States. Mostly they are large tracts of land, important to Native American sacred sites and for natural beauty and unique geographic formations. But there are also acres involving forts and battlegrounds that include a monument for K9 dogs at an army base in Texas, Stonewall in New York, Cesar Chavez's home in California, African American burial places, and a home that honors Buffalo soldiers. Of the 128 monuments, only one has an Asian American theme, and that is for a Japanese internment camp at Tule Lake. Identifying and designating monuments and historic sites, funding for protecting them and explaining them to visitors, and providing for humanities programs are important. They allow us to select permanent markers that the nation believes should be preserved because of the enduring values and the stories represented there, in which we want to pass to generations after generations. So returning to the question, why are our stories not well known? You need to ask yourself and your organizations and your representatives, why are there so few monuments, landmarks, and funding for API sites and stories for places such as the Summit Tunnel? So thank you for allowing me to be part of DOT's APIA Heritage Month.
Thank you, Ted. Next, we'll hear from Chinese American Museum Director David Yui. The Chinese American story serves as a blueprint for American fortitude and resilience. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for inviting me to this celebration.